نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Today, inshallah, we will be starting with the life of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam post 6 years of age. Last talk, we ended at the point in our Prophet's life where he had lost his mother. And so at this point, he had lost both of his parents. He was an orphan. So the Prophet ﷺ's father passed away when his mother was still pregnant with him. And when he was 6 years old, he lost his mother as well. And so then he was entrusted to his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. Abdul Muttalib was the chieftain of the Quraysh. Once again, we hardly have anything about Abdul Muttalib's relationship with the Prophet ﷺ, other than like a few tidbits from here and there. We know that, for example, Abdul Muttalib had raised like a platform in front of, connected to the Kaaba, and around the time of Asr, when the shadow of the Kaaba would be shading that platform, it said that he would sit there and discuss the affairs of the Quraysh. All right. So then this would be the platform that would kind of be equivalent to like a throne or like a leader's seat. So no one really sits on this platform or in this like made up seat other than Abdul Muttalib himself, other than the chieftain himself. Okay. It's exclusively for him. But once, when Rasulullah ﷺ was a young boy, he actually came running and he jumped onto the platform in order to be next to Abdul Muttalib. And he had his uncles, Zubair and others, who sort of pulled him back down immediately. You know how, like, when a child tries to leap for something and the adults around him quickly pull him back down to sort of bring him back to ground with them. So his uncles pulled him back down, but Abdul Muttalib stopped them. And he said, leave him. This is my child, and he can remain on the platform. Okay. So out of all of his grandchildren and children and many other family members that he had, Abdul Muttalib only allowed Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to sit on that platform with him because that is how much he adored and loved the Prophet. Okay. There's one more incident that narrates the special care, the special love, and the special concern that Abdul Muttalib had for his grandson. On one occasion, the uncles of the Prophet ﷺ sent him to find some lost camels. Okay. And the reason that they did that is because the little 7 or 8-year-old Rasulullah ﷺ never did anything except that it was quite successful when he did it. Okay. So now at this point, the uncles were getting desperate to find the camels that had suddenly gotten lost, and they had tried every other method. They couldn't find those camels. And so they decided to send this young boy out alone into the desert to find them. But the Prophet ﷺ got a little bit delayed in coming back. So when Abdul Muttalib found out what his sons had done, what the uncles of Rasulullah ﷺ had done, he was furious at them. Okay. He was very angry. He was constantly pacing and walking around and waiting for the Prophet ﷺ to come back. And when the Prophet did, in fact, return safe and sound, he hugged the Prophet tightly and he said that from now on, I will never let you out of my sight. And that just shows how much he loved Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. But grief upon grief, at the age of 8, for the third time, the Prophet ﷺ was left without a guardian or anyone that was directly taking care of him because Abdul Muttalib passed away. The Prophet was 8 years old at this time. Ibn Sa'id mentions in a narration that when a Sahabi asked the Prophet ﷺ, do you remember Abdul Muttalib, Ya Rasulullah? Abdul Muttalib was a legend among the Arabs. And so, the Sahaba were curious to know. The Prophet said, yes, I remember him. I was 8 years old when he died. So that's how we know that most likely the Prophet was 8 when Abdul Muttalib passed away. One of the things that Abdul Muttalib did on his deathbed is that he entrusted Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to his son Abu Talib. Okay, now mind you, Abdul Muttalib had multiple wives, and from those multiple wives, he had multiple sons. However, Abu Talib was the full brother of Abdullah, the father of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Abu Talib and Abdullah shared the same mother and the same father. Okay, and so Abu Talib was a full brother of Abdullah, the father of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Abu Talib took charge of the Prophet, and then Abu Talib is the one who became his guardian. And then he went on to live like a long life, and he eventually passed away when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was over 50 years old. Okay, so then the Prophet remained with him as his child, at the remaining childhood and the remaining teenagehood. All right. Okay. So why did Allah put so many trials on such a young child? 3 orphanhoods, one after the other, upon Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If Allah had willed, he could have had very loving parents and he could have been born in the lap of luxury. So why? There are a few reasons why this could have happened. Okay. The first reason is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says this to Musa alayhi salam as well, and it might be something he also says to Rasulullah, which is that I chose you to myself. Excuse me one more. Sorry, had a bit of a cough. Coming back to it. So it is said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even said to Musa alayhi salam that I chose you for myself so that you, and then in another verse it says, so that you may be raised under my care. And so this most likely applies to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well, right? The second reason for that is that no doubt it is incredibly tough and incredibly difficult to be an orphan. But at the same time, it gives him many of these qualities that he will need later on in life. Okay, being pampered would not have prepared him for a life of sacrifice and mission calling to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And rather, the fact that he was born in a harsh environment and not having parents that, loved him and pampered him so much, this automatically makes him stronger, more independent, more mature. It gives him more wisdom. Okay. And this is something that we might notice in a lot of orphan children or in a lot of children that are born in difficult circumstances. Compared to children born in luxury, the children born in difficult circumstances tend to be forced to grow up and therefore have more maturity than others. Okay? This is the reality. I understand that since we now have a lot more knowledge when it comes to psychology, when it comes to what should I call it? Like the effects of, childhood instability later on in life, one might have the question in our minds that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went through such a difficult time. How then did he have such a stable adulthood as opposed to, being constantly under the cloud of stress and anxiety and worry and tension? And this is something we will address later on in the episodes when we see how Rasulullah dealt with the trials and tribulations that he kept going throughout life. But just to answer the question here and now, one of the most incredible and important qualities of our Prophet ﷺ was his ability to connect to God and his ability to disconnect from this world. Okay, he never gave too much importance to the world. He had an incredible muscle to be positive about situations. He would always connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he would complain to Allah. He would cry. Later on, when we get to the part of the Prophet's life that he spent in Medina, when he lost his son Ibrahim, who was just a little newborn, the Prophet was crying so much his beard got wet. And he kept saying that, we will simply, like, he kept saying that we'll just make dua to Allah for this. The Prophet's spiritual connection was so strong that no matter what he went through in this world, and mind you, he went through so much, it still kept him stable. It still kept him anchored. It did not let him feel like he was losing control. Okay. And that is such an incredible part of his character that we can learn from. That even though he had such a difficult childhood, and to be honest, a very difficult teenagehood. Perhaps the only real part of stability that came within the Prophet's life was from when he was married to Hazrat Khadija up until he got Nabuwat. And even then, he had a lot of existential questions on who are we to worship and what is God and what is life, right? But even then, the Prophet ﷺ has always been like this boulder of strength because he was so strong within his own self. The Prophet's inner world was incredibly strong integrity to it. And that is what carried him through. Allah carried him through. The Quran carried him through. The connection to Islam carried him through. Having that sense of purpose that he is here in life with a mission to complete is what carried him through. And these are the things that can carry us through as well. We have a potential of strength within us that we sometimes do not yet recognize because we get so tangled up within the problems of the world itself. But when we kind of space ourselves out, kind of look at our lives from a third person perspective, it makes us realize, my God, what privilege we live in, and how many opportunities Allah has given us to prove how strong we are, and to prove that even if we live a privileged life, that Jannah is still within our reach. Okay, so this is the second point, right? That it gives the Prophet ﷺ those qualities that he will need later on to be an excellent leader in life. The third is that when you go through difficult times, that makes you be more empathetic. It makes you understand and experience firsthand what poverty, what ruthlessness, what living in hardship can be like. And this makes you more sensitive and more compassionate and more merciful. And honestly, this is something I can say of any experience any of us go through. Okay. If you've been through an experience in life that is very difficult, maybe it is financial instability. Maybe it is that once upon a time in life you went through a very dark, depressive phase. Maybe it's the loss of a child at any stage, whether it's at conceiving them or at later on. When you go through such a horrible, terrible period in your life, and then by his grace, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pulls you out of it. And you find that strength to keep on continuing, keep going through that trench until the trench ends and you come out on the other side, alive and well. You suddenly find within yourself a certain kind of softness and a kindness and an ability to empathize with the people who are going through that experience you've been through. And a mark of good leadership is that you are able to see the people that you are leading and see the different kinds of experiences they are suffering through and be able to give them either a solution or support that will help them through that terrible experience because you've been through it and you were able to get out of it, and therefore you can help them get out of it as well. So that is an invaluable experience that the Rasulullah ﷺ had, because later on, many years down after this point in his life, when he saw other people around him dealing with the same kind of pain he dealt with when he was growing up, he could be there as a better support system for them. And this is why there are so many ahadith about taking care of orphans, right? where there's one where the Prophet has said that I and the one who takes care of orphans will be like this in Jannah, and he gestured to his forefinger and middle finger, holding them close together. Okay. And there's another where he says, when you see an orphan, say good words to him and put a hand across his head, meaning treat the orphans with love. Because the Prophet ﷺ is remembering his own childhood as an orphan when he is saying these ahadiths. Okay. And by going through these traumatic times, our Rasulullah ﷺ developed this fondness and softness and mercy and tenderness for the weak, which was a very necessary requirement for being a prophet. Okay. And also, as sort of a tangential point, because of the fact that the Prophet ﷺ moved in between his relatives so much, this facilitated that the Prophet was raised by Banu Sa'd, and so he became one of the most eloquent Arabs. Okay. In fact, it's known that Rasulullah ﷺ spoke the best Arabic. And there's a hadith of the Prophet where he said that I have been given by Allah the most precise or concise of all speech. Okay. Jawa'ul kalam means that a small phrase that can be explained and understood because of its deep meanings and how profound it is. So that's another advantage that the Prophet ﷺ had. Okay, then we come to the teenagers of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. All right. This is when he was a young man, around 14 to 15 years old. Again, as we have mentioned many times before, we don't know a lot about this phase of the Prophet's life at this age. Okay, the early life of Rasulullah ﷺ is largely, mostly undocumented. Okay, we don't have a lot except for maybe one or two stories here and there. And again, I will tell you why. It is because, number one, nobody was really witnessing or recording these incidences. The Prophet was an orphan. He did not come from an incredibly elite family background that his life should have been recorded. Nobody knew he was a prophet at that time. There was no writing in Makkah. And then the people who lived long enough to narrate these stories were very, very few people. Okay, so this is why we don't know a lot from this point of the Prophet's life. However, we do know that the Prophet ﷺ's first job was that of a shepherd. Okay. In fact, the Prophet himself has said that Allah never sent a prophet except that he was a shepherd, to which the Sahaba asked, not even you, Ya Rasulullah, because they thought that the Prophet ﷺ might have been an exception. But the Prophet said, I was a shepherd. I used to tend the flock of the people in Makkah in return from some qararit. So qararit are like some pennies or like a very small amount of money. Okay. There is actually another instance also where the Prophet ﷺ saw some shepherds taking care of the sheep that they had, and he said that I advise you to find the tree of arak. So the tree of arak, you would literally, if you were to Google it, it might come up with like a toothbrush tree. Okay, that's called the tree of arak. And the Prophet said to them, I advise you to find the tree of arak and find the darker branches, as this will be better for your flock. And those shepherds were shocked, by the way, that a prophet knew this information. So they asked, how do you know this, Ya Rasulullah? And he said, I used to be a shepherd, and every prophet of Allah used to be a shepherd. Okay. And there's another hadith where the Prophet said Musa was sent to become a prophet when he was a shepherd. Dawood was sent when he was a shepherd. And I too was a shepherd in the valley of Ajiyad. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had wanted, Rasulullah could have been born rich with money that could have been poured upon him as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala let the Prophet start his life with one of the most menial, most lowest paying, and maybe even one of the most difficult jobs in Makkah? There are a few reasons why scholars say, and people have assumed, that this might have been. Okay. Reason number one, when you were a shepherd, you have the opportunity to spend time alone with your thoughts. Okay. You're taking your flock away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It allows you to contemplate the purpose of existence. It's no coincidence that those who are absorbed in their work and their worldly pursuits and material gains and everything, those people have a harder time being spiritual, right? They may be less spiritual. Um, we see in the world around us even that atheism is more prevalent in wealthy countries with high paying jobs. Okay. And then on the other hand, you have farmers who spend their days tending to the land and observing nature and are generally more contemplative and more religious. Because when you're involved with nature, um, the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it tends to really make your mind think about how all of this came into being. It impacts your soul. Okay. I imagine it would be very difficult to be an atheist if you're just constantly surrounded by nature and observing the cycles of nature. And conversely, when you're cut off from the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you're immersed in dunya, you're drowning in it, then your heart becomes hard and you could even become so arrogant as to say that there is no God. Okay. Another reason is that sheep are similar to men. How so? Well, they need to be taken care of or else they will go astray. And this is why the shepherd is there. The shepherd is there to guide them and to protect them. Okay. Um, each animal, by the way, each sheep in a flock has its own unique personality. And a good shepherd understands that. He knows how to treat each animal according to whatever the individual needs of the animal is. There are some sheep out there, or some goat, or some other herded animals like cows, by the way, that have their own personality. They're stubborn. They require a firmer hand. And there are other animals, other sheep that are a bit more sensitive. They require a gentler approach. Okay. Some sheep know where they're going. There are other sheep who will just follow the pack. Okay. A good shepherd knows that each animal has its own individuality and they deal with them accordingly. And this is what a leader needs to do. And this is what the prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala needed the most as an experience. Another reason is that being a shepherd makes you soft and tender on one side and brave and courageous on the other side. Okay, you have to be gentle, you have to be compassionate with your flock of sheep, but you also have to be brave and courageous when you are defending them against, carnivorous animals like wolves or coyotes or wild dogs or other such animals, other such beasts. All right. And also, by the way, it's not a coincidence that the Prophet ﷺ was so tender towards animals as well, because it's narrated that a camel once approached the Prophet and it was making these distressing noises and its eyes seemed to be very watery or almost as if it had tears in it. So the Prophet ﷺ comforted that camel until it calmed down. And then he went and he found the owner of that camel and he told him, this camel has complained against you that you overwork it, you underfeed it, and you beat it. Fear Allah with regards to these animals that Allah has blessed you with. So the Prophet wasn't just there, by the way, to speak up for human rights, for people's rights. La, the Prophet was there for animal rights as well. So before we think to ourselves that it is okay for us to treat animals in an abusive way, whether they are stray or whether they are domesticated, remember that the Prophet said this to this man, that fear Allah for the fact that even animals can complain against you, can complain against the behavior you're doing against them. And this is quite, by the way, apt for this time. We're in Dhul Hijjah, and Eid al-Adha is about to come. And some of you might have sacrificial animals, and some of you might have children or family members who will take these sacrificial animals around for, a walk around the neighborhood or something like that. please be gentle with these animals. I know that they're sacrificial. I know that on the first day or the second day or the third day of Eid, they will be slaughtered and you will be eating up their meat and their biryani and everything. I understand that very well. But until then, until that they are alive, you are to treat them with gentleness. They should have food so that they are not going hungry for many long hours. They should have clean water to drink. They should have some clean space to sit. Don't tie them so tightly and in such a group that they cannot have a space to sit and a space to breathe amongst themselves. And don't hit them. Don't unnecessarily pull the ropes around their necks or their ears or their horns. Don't poke them with sticks. Don't bother them like that. And I know I'm saying this entire list, and it might sound to you that isn't this like the most obvious thing I could be saying? It is. It is the most obvious thing I could be saying. And yet I feel like if we are around in our neighborhood and we see something like this being happening to a cow or a goat that the neighbor has, we sort of we brush it aside and we say, oh, it's, bas bacche baccha, ek baccha jo bas wo baccha ban raha hai. It's just a child. They're just behaving like a child. La, if your child is old enough and aqalmand enough, yani कि wise enough to be able to stand next to that animal, that means they're also old enough for you to teach them how to treat that animal gently. All right. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is noting our behavior with these creatures. They are an amana to us. Just because we've paid some money and brought them back home does not mean we have whole and complete ownership of them. They are creatures of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now, if you treat them badly here, they will speak against you on the day of judgment. And what a loss will it be that you spend so much with such a good niyyah to do such a sacrifice and to follow the sunnah of Ibrahim alayhi salam, only for it to be partially lost because the very animal spoke up against you. Yeah, that doesn't make sense. All right. So be gentle to the creatures around you, whether it's the sacrificial animals or whether it's the cats and everything else, because these are also creatures of Allah. Our Prophet was gentle with them, so we should be gentle with them. Okay. It also shows that the Prophet ﷺ had the understanding that he needed to earn money. Okay. He wasn't just a freeloader. He wasn't just sort of, just being there, having Abu Talib take care of him, thinking to himself, oh, my uncle is already rich enough. He has the backing of the Quraysh behind him. So therefore, I'm not really going to do much. Plus, I'm so sad. I am an orphan. I've been through so much difficulty. No. The Rasulullah did not throw himself a pity party at all. Okay, he did not throw responsibility out the window, but rather he knew that he had to really work himself as well. He had to really get going and take the job that he got and make the money that he could. Okay. Another part is that this also shows how simple the lifestyle of the Prophet ﷺ was. He was really engaged in the most basic, difficult, low-paying manual labor, which teaches us that there is no shame in working hard for your own income. The Prophet ﷺ himself has said that the purest money you can earn is that which you earn with your own hands, and that even Dawood alayhi would earn his money from the labors of his hands. Because for those of you who don't know, Prophet Dawood alayhi was an ironsmith and a carpenter. So even he earned from his own hands. Okay. It also teaches us the value of starting from the bottom and working your way up. When you start from the bottom and you work your way up, you're better equipped to do justice and appreciate the blessings and the success that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses us. Okay. And this is not to say that if you start on the top, you are not ever going to be successful. But rather, when you start from the top and then go further ahead, that is most likely either a coincidence or from birthright. You're born into a family that has that position. Okay. You are born and your parents already have such a load of goodwill that you simply carry on their backs. Right. But the Prophet ﷺ really built himself up from the bottom up. And this is the reality of business as it is of religion. Some of the most successful entrepreneurs we know in this world, they all started from the bottom and they are the ones who ended up building up. And the same applies to Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. He started from square one and worked his way up to the highest pinnacle. And we know how true this is by the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Duha, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says from ayat number 3 to ayat number 11 in Surah Duha, your Lord has not abandoned you, nor has he become hateful of you. And the next life is certainly far better for you than this one. And surely your Lord will give so much to you that you will be pleased. Did he not find you an orphan? Then he sheltered you. Did he not find you unguided? Then guided you. And did he not find you needy and satisfied your needs? So do not oppress the orphan and do not repulse the beggar, and proclaim the blessings of your Lord. So this is the way the character of the Prophet ﷺ started to get built right from when he was just 14, 15 years old. Okay. Then come the Fijar Wars, okay, or what was considered to be the evil wars. So after the incident of the shepherd herd, we have one other incident where when the Prophet ﷺ was a teenager, between like 15 and 18 years old, the Quraysh fought in something called the Harb al-Fijar. Okay. The Harb al-Fijar is the evil wars, right? The Prophet at this point, by the way, was most likely 15 because he did physically fight in the battle, which shows you that he was not of the age to be carrying a sword. All right. Because in those days, older than 15 was when you were regarded as a full adult and you were allowed to carry a sword. All right. So the Quraysh fought in the Harb al-Fijar, the wars of Fijar. So the Fijar War is basically a series of like small battles that broke out between two large tribes of Arabia, which was the Kinana and the Waqais Ailan. Okay. The tribe of Quraysh belonged to Kinana, which was a much larger branch, and another large branch was called the Qais al-An. The Qais Ailan, which was composed of tribes such as the Ghatfan and the Hawazin. And to make a very long story short, a person from Kinana killed somebody from the Hawazin. Okay, remember? So Kinana over here, the larger branch of the tribe that Quraysh belongs to. So someone from Kinana killed someone from Hawazin. Okay, and when they found out, the Hawazin tribe attacked the Canaanite tribes. So these people and these people started fighting amongst each other. Okay. So the Canaanite tribes, including the Quraysh, by the way, rushed back to Makkah. Okay. And they did this because the rule of law then, as it is now, was that whoever enters the haram is safe. But what happened is that the Hawazin people, they followed them. And because they were so angry at them, they did not care about the sanctity of the haram. And they attacked the Kinana or the Canaanites within the haram as well. Now, the interesting thing is that the initial fault was that of the Canaanite tribes, okay, because killing a person is a crime. However, attacking the sanctity of haram is also a very big crime. And therefore, because of that, the Quraysh declared an all-out war against the Hawazin, and not just the Hawazin, against the Qais Ailan tribes. And so this is now called the Wars of Fijar. Okay? Fijar, evil. It's called this because both sides committed evil. But also especially because these are the wars in which the sanctity of haram was broken. That is considered to be the height of evil. Okay? The Prophet ﷺ's job, by the way, in these wars was to find and look for arrows that missed the target and then return them to his uncles. Okay? Initially, In these wars, the Quraysh were losing, but eventually they won over. And whenever the Prophet ﷺ would appear on the day with the Quraysh, that day they would win over. And then whenever he would not be there, they would lose ground. Okay, so Abu Talib saw this. Abu Talib, remember the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ that is now his guardian? Abu Talib saw this and he said, by Allah, you are going to stay with us. And eventually a peace treaty was enacted. The Quraysh agreed to pay blood money for the crime that was committed. And so the fighting stopped. The Prophet ﷺ, by the way, when he became much older, is recorded to have said that I remember participating in the Fijar Wars, and I would collect arrows from my uncle and hand them back to him, and I do not regret participating in this war. We're going to go over one more incident right now, and then we're going to do a little bit of a recollection on what are the lessons we're getting here from, these little tidbits and stories and scenarios that we are getting of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So this was his participation in the Fijar Wars, okay, in the evil wars. Then came the Hilf al-Fudul. Now, another few years later, another more famous incident occurred, which we call as the Hilf al-Fudul. Okay, it's also called the Hilf al-Mutayyibin, but that's a little bit more of a complicated word. So, Hilf al-Fudul, or the Pact of Fudul, or the Treaty of the Fudul, however you want to translate it. At this stage, by the way, the Prophet ﷺ is probably somewhere in his early 20s. And this is a pact that occurred in Dhul Qa'dah. Dhul Qa'dah is one of the sacred months in which fighting does not happen. And in this pact, Hilf al-Fudul also took place in Makkah. Okay. Now, how did it start? A person from the tribe of Zubayd, which is a tribe from Yemen, by the way. And in Makkah, the tribe of Zubayd are not considered to be among the elite of Makkah. Okay. A person from the tribe of Zubayd sold a number of items to Al-As ibn Wa'il, Al-As ibn Wa'il, who is the father of Amr ibn al-As. Okay. And so this person from Zubayd sold items to Al-As bin Wa'il before Hajj as a merchant. This guy was a merchant. And Al-As bin Wa'il is a chieftain. He's a politician. He's a career statesman in the Quraysh, and he is a very rich businessman. And so he told the man, I'll give you the money after Hajj before you go back to Yemen. And because he had so many points attached to his reputation that I just said, right? Chieftain, politician, statesman, rich businessman. Because he had all of this reputation attached to him, this man agreed. This man was okay with it, that he would receive the money for the wares he sold him after Hajj. So this man performs Hajj, and then he goes to Al-As and he asks for his money. But Al-As says, come back tomorrow, And so he does that. And then Al-As says, come back tomorrow. And so he does that again. And this continues on and on until this man realizes that he is not going to get his money back. So this person then goes to other sub-tribes in the Quraysh. Okay, for example, he goes to Banu Hashim, he goes to Banu Abdul Dar, and he asks for help from everyone, but everybody makes an excuse because Al-As is a rich politician. You don't go against rich politicians even at that time. And so this tribesman of Zubayd, he's here by himself. He is alone. The rest of his tribesmen are all the way in Yemen. So there aren't many people that are ready to fight for him or for his cause. So he is now feeling very trapped, and he decides to make this into a public issue. In those days, by the way, to make things public, people would compose poems and announce them, okay? So this is exactly what this man did. One day he said a poem out loud when everybody was gathered around the Kaaba. Now there's an Arabic of this poem, but I will read the translation out to you. He said, "O family of Fihr," which is the Quraysh, "I am the one who has been unjustly treated because of my merchandise. I am in the valley of Makkah, far away from my home and away from people to protect me. I'm still in Ihram. My hair is not combed, nor have I finished my Umrah. Where are my men to help me? Between Hijr and Hajar, you are doing this to me. Hijr, by the way, referring to the Hijr of Ismail alayhi salam, and Hajar is the Hajar al-Aswad, the stone. So between the Hijr and the Hajar, you are doing this to me. The true haram belongs to those who are noble. There is no sanctity to the one who wears a thobe while he is a traitor. Now, just as a tangent, after I read this translation, if you think to yourself, wow, that was not a poem or poetic at all, I can assure you in Arabic it is. Unfortunately, translations have the ability to butcher the beauty of the original language, which is, as a side note, incredibly high reason to go out there and learn the Arabic language. Anyways, after this poem got done, the news spread like wildfire. Okay, Al-Zubayr ibn Abdul Muttalib, who was the uncle of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, decided that something had to be done about this after he heard all of this. So he convened and gathered all of the senior members of the Quraysh in the house of Abdullah ibn Judan. Abdullah ibn Judan, for a small context, is a very distant uncle of Aisha radiallahu anha, and he is considered to be of the noblest people of Makkah in terms of hospitality and in terms of genuine sincerity. So all of the senior members of the Quraysh were gathered in the house of Abdullah ibn Judan, and here is where they agreed to have a treaty that they would side with the oppressed against the oppressor, regardless of their tribe, even if the one who is shown injustice is from a faraway tribe and the oppressor is from the Quraysh. And they all went in front of the Kaaba and they signed their names on a document. Now, I know you might think to yourself, I thought most of them are unlettered, meaning they can't read or write. So what they would do instead, in order to show their promise, in order to show a variation of a signature, is that they would dip their hand in perfume and put that perfume on the Kaaba on the same place. Okay. So this is why this is also called the Hilf al-Mutayyibin, which is the name I said earlier. Hilf al-Mutayyibin also translates to the treaty of those who have perfumed themselves. Okay. By the way, in case you're wondering, fudul, is that like the fudul, like the fuzul word we use in Urdu? Actually, yes, it is. And it's called hilful fudul because when Al-As heard of this, he says, why did they have to get involved in this matter, which is fuduli, which is none of their business? Okay. So this is how we remember this pact, either the Hilf al-Fudul, the pact in which people who had none of their business still made it their business, or the pact of the Al-Mutayyibin, which is the people who had perfumed themselves. So when the Prophet ﷺ, by the way, then the conclusion of this is that they were able to then give that merchant from the Zubayr tribe his correct, proper money. Okay, and justice was served. When the Prophet ﷺ was much older and he would remember this time, he said that I witnessed in the house of Abdullah ibn Judan a treaty that were I asked to uphold it even in Islam, I would do so. And I would not be willing to give up my place for a lot of red camels. Meaning that the Prophet ﷺ was incredibly proud to be a part of this treaty, and he would not give up his place in this treaty even for a lot of money. Okay. And he even said that in that treaty, they all agreed that the rights would be given back to the one who deserved them, and that no oppressor would have an upper hand over the one who is oppressed. So this was the pact of Fudul, Hilf al-Fudul. Now, what lessons did we learn going through these scenarios? The first is the Prophet ﷺ did not regret participating in the wars of Fijar, which showed that what he did was correct. Okay. Some scholars have derived from this that it is permissible to fight in wars that are not necessarily religious, because in this war, both sides were pagan. There was no clear-cut good or evil, but it is a war to defend haram and to defend the sanctity of the haram. So the Prophet ﷺ participated in it. Okay. And so one may argue that the Prophet did not directly physically fight in it. He still did aid it. Okay. And so the bottom line to this is that even in wars that are not purely religious, Muslims do have some leeway to get involved. All right. Um, the second is in the incident of Hilf al-Fudul. The Prophet ﷺ was actively involved in society at that time, even though that society was not Muslim. And the causes that he got involved with were not purely religious, but nonetheless, they were causes that involved justice, truth, and helping the oppressed. And the Prophet is very proud to have been there. The fact that we just read this hadith where the Prophet said that I would uphold the treaty even now clearly shows us that getting involved in public causes that bring about justice is a part of being a good Muslim. Okay. And so the Prophet ﷺ was an active member of his society and supported justice regardless of religion. Okay. Another is that it clearly also demonstrates the status of the Prophet ﷺ because he is called a witness to a treaty and he is the youngest participant over there at 20 years old. So this shows that the people he lived with, that society, the people in Quraysh, they saw in him a future leader. They saw in him excellent qualities because they saw in him somebody who is truthful and honest and well respected. So we sometimes just think to ourselves, oh, I'm too young right now. Oh, I can't really, do much for myself. Or this, we think that age is the only thing that brings about strong characteristics and experience. But actually, even at the age of young 20s, the Prophet had already established himself to have such an incredible character. Okay. Another thing that it demonstrates is that despite all of the differences and all of the problems that the Quraysh had, they still had characteristics of nobility and virtue. They agreed to come together to help the wronged and the oppressed, even though it was the time of Jahiliyyah, there was still an element of good in them. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ then was sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to revive those very virtues they already possessed. All right. So we're going to end here for today. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.